Going to call to order our workshop this afternoon. I'd like to declare a quorum of 7 trustees here. On time, yes. Let's not neglect to mention that. It's going to take us to item C, public comments. Do we have any? This one? We do not. It's going to move to our workshop session. D1, consideration, discussion, and possible action related to naming TASB delegate and alternate for 2021 Texas Association of School Board Delegate Assembly. Mr. Martindale.
Is there any more for me to say, Mr. Nugent? It's that time for the board to consider who would like to serve on the as a part of the delegate assembly at TASB. We get to select a delegate as well as an alternate. Last year, that was Ms. Nolan and Ms. McAdams, and I think the year before that was Ms. Green and Ms. Nolan. 2 years prior to. It's on the 25th. It's a part of TASB. It's on that Saturday. And of course, this group works in electing TASB's leadership team and also works on the advocacy agenda. So yes, we need to submit those as a district here in the near future. So I'm looking for volunteers.
I have a quick question. Do you know if does the alternate get to go, or is the alternate only as backup?
I do not know the answer to that, but I can check for you.
Well, okay.
I can't remember.
I know, I can't remember. I thought the first, before COVID, so whenever it was in person, I thought the alternate could go. Because I was just going to suggest that 2 people go, the person and the alternate, and so we set it up. So the alternate is going to be the main person the following year, right? Because there's a little bit of getting used to how it all works.
I don't know what would prevent us from sending both.
I don't remember getting carded at the door. I'll say that.
Right.
I was alone. I do know the alternate didn't go when I did it, but.
Right. that would just be my suggestion. My suggestion would be that Kimberly go as the representative this year, and then we have an alternate, and the alternate then be the person for the alternate go ahead and go this year, and then be the person for next year. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you for nominating me.
I was going to say.
Hey, you're welcome.
No, because I did listen to it. Last year it was all virtual, right? And it did go seemingly, I think, long last year. But it was very interesting, and there's and I do feel like I think there was, at least I personally last year wouldn't have felt like I was even in a place to offer any opinion. And I don't even know if I would be, again, there's 1,000 representatives there. But I do think I think that's probably a reasonable recommendation. And I actually think when I did it many years ago, I think I was an alternate, and you could sit in the room, you just couldn't vote, right? If I recall.
I think that's how it worked.
I think so.
I should have looked it up.
I'm a little, I can't believe, first of all, it's going to take this long.
Well, nobody's.
Because usually we just say it's the new guy and move on down the road.
You want to be my alternate, Thomas?
I suggest Horak.
Okay.
Nobody's picking on him.
Well, I feel a little weird. We're certainly not naming the delegate for next year.
Right.
Yeah.
So I believe we have Ms. McAdams as a delegate and you as alternate, Mr. Horak.
Delegate if you want me to.
Awesome.
Mr. Martindale, does that require
I'm
a
good with
motion,
it.
or are we good?
I'm good.
So you want to be the delegate?
Either one.
Okay.
You would prefer the delegate, correct?
I think it's
You were alternate last year.
I think there's some logic.
Okay,
into
so
that,
Kimberly would be delegate, you can be the alternate. Everybody's good with that? There we are. Ms.
We have a
Horn, you
motion?
have that down so we can make those submissions?
Do we need to vote on that?
I don't think we
Okay,
necessarily need an
okay.
action.
Fair enough. Congratulations.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well done. Well played over there, Mr. Hall. Okay. D2, consideration, discussion, and possible action related to the 2021-22 budget and tax rate. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent. Board members, we've been speaking about this since March, so this will be the first of about 25 times you hear from Ms. Strauss tonight as we come forward with the final proposed budget and accompanying tax rate. So, Ms. Strauss?
Thank you, Mr. Martindale. I appreciate it. So, as mentioned, none of this information should be new, except maybe some final tax rate information because we had to wait on the certified tax roll. But tonight, we're going to go over it one more time. We're going to talk about the summary of the adoption process, the factors that were influencing the budget this year, our budget goals, the proposed budget for all three required funds, the proposed tax rates, the confusing language and differences between the motion and the resolution is what we'll be covering tonight. The budget and tax rate adoption process, first of all, the budget has to be proposed to the Board of Trustees by August 20th. And so we're well ahead of that, and we've talked about it many times, but it has to be adopted before August 31st of each year. The budget at a minimum has to be at the function level. So those are the major categories within the actual budget, instructional, staff development, that sort. And it has to include the general fund, the debt service fund, and the child nutrition fund. There are a number of other funds, grants, construction, and those sorts, but because they're for specific purposes, they do not have to be an adopted budget. We must hold a public hearing on the budget and the tax rate, and it must be published. A summary of the budget must be posted on the district's website, and it has to be at the same time that we publish that in the newspaper of the public hearing, so that's already been done. And we can adopt the budget and the tax rate either at the same or separate meetings, but the budget must come before the tax rate. Kind of seems backwards because you need to know what you're going to be able to generate for revenue before you adopt the budget, but budget must come first. And then we have to post the budget on the website and file it with TEA. That's the final step. So we had a number of things influencing our budget that caused some things to go up and down constantly. Of course, the pandemic last year and in the coming year. ESSER funds 1, 2, and 3 have affected this upcoming budget. Our uncertain enrollment, property values that came in certified at the end of July, and of course the legislative session that is every 2 years, normally ends on or about June 1st, and so we have very little time after that to make any adjustments. Our budget goals have remained the same throughout the entire process, and that is to recruit and retain a high-quality workforce to support instruction, support quality instruction in the way of staffing, supplies, equipment, and services, and maintain a financially healthy fund balance. So our budget assumptions for this year is a 3.2% enrollment growth. And that equates to 14,101 to be exact on 3.2%. We also use that same percentage on our average daily attendance from where we ended this past year, and that's on actual, not hold harmless. So that was 13,160. We also have a weighted average daily attendance that factors into our revenue. And if you're not sure what that is, it's really your average daily attendance, but some special populations get weighted, such as special education, CTE, a little bit heavier because those areas have special funding and there's some additional costs that goes along with them. And then our property value growth as compared to last year when the final certified came in grew at 4.11%. So those were the major assumptions that we used in preparing the budget. So just in brief, to summarize the revenue, for the general fund and debt service fund, the primary source of revenue, of course, is the property taxes. So you can see that, and then we have other local. For state revenue, you've got what we call foundation revenue. That's flowing through from the state, and TRS on behalf, which is the state's portion of TRS that they pay for our employees. So that is also an expense of the same amount, so it's a wash. And then federal revenues, which is mainly our SHARS, Medicaid reimbursement program, and indirect costs from our federal funds. Debt service has a little bit of state revenue, but the rest of it is property taxes, and it's $29,525,000. And then our child nutrition program of $7,246,545. So the total proposed revenue for the three budgeted funds is $161,506 and $817. And this is the proposed appropriations. This is at the function level that I discussed with you previously. This is at the minimum level that you have to adopt. So the general fund, the proposed budget appropriations is $127,644,303. Debt service, $29,525,000, and child nutrition, $7,246,545, for that total of $164.4 million plus a little change. So in summary, when you compare those proposed revenues and appropriations, for the general fund, the appropriations exceed revenues by $2,909,031, and debt service and child nutrition are both a balanced budget. So again, the total deficit there is $2,909,031. So in looking at that deficit, I mean, we are mindful of it, so we have some plans for addressing it. First of all, for the second year of the biennium, the state funding formula changes because instructional materials is all funded up front. So our estimate, if we use the same enrollment, would be an additional $2.6 million in the second year of the biennium. That is also based on a 2% property value growth. We will look at where we think our enrollment will end up and our average daily attendance. Once we get about 6 weeks into the year, we'll have some better data and adjust revenues, hopefully to the better, based on our enrollment. So we'll bring that forth at some point. And we have ESSER 2 funds. We've talked about a lot of ESSER 1 and 3 because we know those dollar amounts. ESSER 2 funds, we don't know how much is going to be available to us yet. We should know that in about September. But we want to use it for allowable uses, but also for what's in the best interest of the district and instruction. So we'll be focusing in on that once we know the final amount. And of course, we'll continue to review our expenditures and staffing efficiencies as we go throughout the year. So just some of the highlights of what's included in the general fund. The Board of Trustees approved the compensation plan at the July board meeting, but in that plan, there was an increase in the beginning teacher pay from $45,500 to $47,000. It also had at least a $1,000 increase for our returning teachers from their prior year base salary. There was a 1.5% pay increase from the midpoints of all the other pay groups. That's administrative, professional, paraprofessional, and auxiliary. And there was an increase in the employer contribution to most of our health insurance plans. This is due to a premium increase that was passed through from TRS Active Care. There were a few additional positions in the area of special education and pre-kindergarten. And we have some increases for inflation for areas such as utilities and property and casualty insurance. But for the most part, not a whole lot of additions. It was mainly in the area of staffing and some required ones. So for debt service, our current tax rate is 26.3 cents. You'll see in a little bit on the proposed tax rate. We're recommending to retain that tax rate at the same. That will allow us to pay principal and interest on all of our scheduled debt, as well as do some early redemptions, which will save the taxpayers and the district in the long run interest and set us up better for the future. So we're not recommending any increase in that. So now coming to the tax rate, this is the fun part. For 21-22, we talked about that 4.11% increase in the property values. Well, anything above 2.5%, we're going to we are required to compress our tax rate down. Okay, so with 4.11, that's going to bring our maintenance and operations rate, which supports our general fund, to 95.22 cents. compared to where we are for this current fiscal year of 96.6 cents, that's 1.38 cents less than where we were last year. And if we keep the debt service rate the same, that makes our total rate $1.2152 compared to 1.229. So again, that 1.38 cent decline. So just a little history. If you look back to 2017-18, when our tax rate was $1.398, a lot of things happened in there. You had House Bill 3 that forced the tax rate down. But if you look at our proposed rate now of $1.2152, that's over an 18-cent decline since 2017-18. It's a little over 13% in that time period. So at 5 years, 18-cent decline for our taxpayers. So now we get to what we call the required motion to support that tax rate that we just discussed. So when looking at how we're going to do the motion, we have to look at how the total tax rate will be higher when we calculate what we call a no new revenue rate. So what that no new revenue rate is saying using the same property values we had for 2021, what tax rate would be required to generate the same revenue? Okay? Don't put out any new construction, just so this would be increase in values, that sort of thing. If that no new revenue rate, abbreviated NNR, which is a little bit easier to say, is less than what we're proposing, then the motion must state that we are increasing the tax rate. So very confusing. Actual declines, but the motion will say that it is increasing. And then we will calculate the percentage on that total tax rate, debt service and maintenance and operations. So this no new revenue rate is the total tax rate. So when it gets to the motion, this language is what is required. So a little confusing. Yes, we are declining, but the motion will say we're increasing. So now to confuse it a little bit more, the tax rate must be adopted by a resolution. And the resolution is going to be a little bit different than the motion. So in this one, when you're looking at it, you're adopting the two rates. You must do them separately, and they are listed separately in the resolution that you'll see later in the meeting. But when you talk about that no new revenue rate and the increase, they only want the information on the maintenance and operations rate. Okay, and this is because as a board, you can adopt whatever rate is required to pay the principal and interest on your debt payments because the voters approved those. So it's going to be a little different. 2.65% is the calculated percentage increase. And then the resolution must also use that increase and say what that would do for a $100,000 home. So, like I said, we're really going down on the tax rate, but we're going to, motion and resolution will both say that we're increasing, but by different percentages. All the same tax rate though, right? Went pretty quickly. Is this, except for the information on the tax rates, I think most of it has been shared before, but I'll entertain any questions you may have.
I think you did a great job explaining it. Thank you. Because it is complicated. I certainly wish everybody in the community can understand it when it, but I did one question on that, the NNR. Mm-hmm. When you're saying that it's based on no new revenue, I'd make sure, is that overall? Is that, does it matter if we have more students or not?
It's just taxes.
It's just taxes, so, okay.
Doesn't matter. It's
not a per student revenue.
It's just revenue.
Doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Right, got it.
Anything else? All right.
Okay,
See you at 6:45.
And 7.
All right, it's going to take us to D3, consideration and discussion regarding board policy EIC, local academic achievement and class ranking. Mr. Martindale.
Why did you kind of giggled on this one like you did the delegate assembly?
I'm just happy tonight.
The board will recall last fall we made some adjustments with course offerings, in particular removing the pre-AP label, moving to advanced label for a number of different courses. Through that work with that particular committee, there was some reflection and some question as to whether there might be a good time to possibly review our current class ranking and GPA system. This is, and then make sure I'm being recorded and quoted and everything else. Make sure, get this right, Chelsea. This is merely a discussion item. This work, discussion item, the work would occur during the course of the fall with the committee. Ms. Parkinson's about to share details with us. And if anything is recommended to the board, it wouldn't be till December, and it would not impact any current high school students at all. Did you get all that, Chelsea? Because I can repeat it to you again. Okay, there will be no immediate impact, and this is just the beginning of a conversation that kind of came from when we were looking at course titles last fall. So with more detail, and we'll say it much better than I did. More, yeah, right, Ms. Parkinson.
All right, good evening. As Mr. Martindale noted, the potential committee to look at policy EIC local more, I have a green light, is it not working? Am I good? Okay, sorry. The potential committee to examine policy EIC local was born from some work last fall that we did with a committee that was focused on pre-AP and our advanced academics and our offerings. And so at that time, the College Board made some changes to the pre-AP program that we convened an internal committee of administrators, counselors, teachers, and students to examine whether we wanted to continue with the College Board's program with that pre-AP designation. The outcome of that committee last fall was that we would rather move forward with our own locally designated and designed advanced academic courses. And at that time, it resulted in a small revision to this same policy, EIC local, last December. You'll note that that's the change of pre-AP and honors into that advanced nomenclature. So throughout that conversation with that committee, we kept circling back to this question, like, what would it take? Why can't we talk about GPA in this conversation? Why do we have all of these different types of classes? And we had some really rich conversations during our discussions in workshop even. We noted that this is a big topic with lots of layers. And if we were going to re-examine this, we wanted to make sure we were doing that with more voices in the room. And that is what brings us to today, this providing information about this potential committee. So this committee would examine the board policy, EIC local, to determine whether any changes need to be recommended for consideration by the CSISD Board of Trustees. And so I should have bolded and underlined to determine whether or not, right? We have no preconceived ideas. We have lots of questions. We have lots of areas, lots of layers within the policy that need to be explored. But this committee really would be charged with this task. This committee would potentially begin work at the end of September. If the board chooses to charter the committee at the September board meeting. These changes, if any were made, would be implemented for an incoming freshman class. So as Mr. Martindale noted, this would not impact anyone who is already in high school, as it says on the slide as well. Okay, so as we've thought about how we would structure the committee would need to have an in-depth knowledge of the policy itself. There are many facets to it. We also would need the committee members to have a working knowledge of the different course offerings across all content areas. Not because the committee would have any influence in what we were offering per se, but because we want to make sure they understand our Tier 1 weighted courses and how they're represented across the core subject areas as well as in our electives such as fine arts and CTE, and how all of that combines toward creating a student's GPA. We want to make sure that we have a good understanding of all of those facets. Policy EIC local is is just that. It is local, and the more research I have done, the more differences I have seen between the way school districts structure this policy. And so we would also review comparable school districts of our size with our high academic standards and so forth. And after all of that research and work, then we would start talking about whether or not we would like to make any changes in our policy. You may also remember that another reason for waiting until this school year to revisit this committee is that we wanted to make sure that we had our strategic design process complete. So you'll note I put our framework for success as a reminder there, because any changes that we would potentially recommend, and as we examine these policies, we want to make sure that they are aligned with our revised board beliefs and commitments, with that revised vision statement, with our learner outcomes and our learner profiles and all of those things, to make sure that that really does represent what we are about and how we want to serve our students. So just a brief overview of the different pieces of policy EIC local. The first section is the consistent application for the graduating class, which just provides clarity that the policy therein applies to everyone within the same graduating class, not necessarily the beginning cohort year, but when they graduate all at the same time together. So for example, if someone graduated early, they're now part of a new graduating class, they would be held to the standards of that graduation year. The calculation section is where there is the explanation of which high school credit courses are included in class rank and GPA. There's some nuance there. There are some things that we do not include, such as some CBEs and things like that would not be included in a GPA. Then section 3 is the nitty gritty of the weighted grading system. So currently we have 2 weights. Tier 1 courses are those 5.0 courses. So those would be our locally designated advanced courses and our advanced placement courses. And then all other courses are in the tier 2 designation. And then we also have a section on local graduation honors in our timeline at which we determine when our seniors have their final class rank and when we determine those graduation honors, which right now is at the end of the 5th 6 weeks of senior year, was when we make that determination for all of our honor graduates and so forth. This policy also distinguishes between our 2 comprehensive high schools, Kensal and CSHS, and College View, which at this time does not have any tiered courses. Everything is weighted equally in the current policy. Okay. So that was the 1-minute overview. If we were to dig into this, there's a whole lot more here, a lot more to it. So once again, we wanted to make sure that if we were to bring this committee forward, we want to have a larger group and more voices in the room. So certainly we would include members of the Board of Trustees, as well as both district and campus level administration, counselors, teachers, students, and parents and community members. And so we are at this time drafting the potential numbers and whatnot for that committee composition. And we have a draft outline of the timeline. And you'll note that we would potentially charter the committee at the next board meeting in September. We've started drafting kind of the focus areas in the timeline. And potentially we would have some wording to bring to the board by December, depending on how the plan goes. Once again, I want to emphasize that we are coming into this with an open mind, and we really want to examine this. And so should the committee at any point before this change their mind or be finished, we will certainly honor the committee's work and bring that forward to you all as well. And once again, this is just the preliminary discussion, and we would bring this back to you again next month.
Any questions?
I just have a quick comment. Thank you for this presentation, by the way. This was great. When you're looking at the makeup of the committee, just a suggestion of maybe from a community member standpoint, looking at recent grads who may still be in town, that can offer that perspective of recently having gone through our high schools.
Yes.
That might be it might offer a unique perspective, not just current students, but those that may have recently graduated.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for that feedback. We've talked about that and just that recent application process and all that. Yes, ma'am.
I love that. I wonder if also anyone affiliated with any of our, any of the universities, maybe A&M or something, would be interested. I don't know.
We do have that unique perspective of all of our connections with the university and with Blinn as well to draw upon.
Yeah, and I just say I think those are both fabulous suggestions. And I mean, really getting a diverse student representation and a diverse kind of parent representation, I think is important in this. And I would just, the other maybe thought, and this is probably farther down the road, is really, I'm sure you've thought about it, but just being really clear on how this is going to be communicated to people, because we just went through one change. And then potentially addressing it again, just how, we have really how we foster two-way communication with the community during the process. I'm sure y'all will.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thanks. I'm glad I know it's not a clean or pretty thing to look at necessarily, but I'm glad we're digging into it. I appreciate y'all's work on it.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you, Ms. Parkinson.
Thank you.
All right, D4, consideration and discussion regarding new laws associated with public education from the 87th Texas Legislative Session. Mr. Martindale.
Thank you, Ms. Nugent, board members. There's a number of changes that came from the most recent legislative session. You've probably seen a number of these referenced in our weekly transmittals. To kind of dig into bigger pieces and more detail from their respective areas, this is going to be a tag team effort. Ms. Strauss is going to handle some of the legislation associated with cleanup of House Bill 3 and the finance piece. And I know Tiffany is going to speak to the accelerated instruction component and the bills associated with that. And Molly's going to speak to the Senate bill associated with healthcare, which we're going to talk about in the regular meeting this evening. So each of these ladies have a big piece of different things that went through Austin this summer relative to their areas of responsibility. So Amy's going to kick off the show.
See, I came back sooner than you thought. Okay. So House Bill 1525 is considered the cleanup bill to House Bill 3. That is the finance bill. It's very common when they did such a huge overhaul that there is some tweaks and some things that they change. And so they just keep modifying it each session. But some adjustments this bill did to the funding allotments was it updated the career and technology education allotment to boost the small and mid-sized districts. It created a tiered system of weights based on the program of study. So this particular item for us did reduce our revenue slightly from what it would have been under prior law. But in time, we feel like based on the programs and the contents that go in, that we can regain that over the years. It recreated the gifted and talented allotment. Many of you may remember that funding source, so that came back in. It changed the fast growth allotment, the eligibility, and it created a tiered system. So this now is more geared to a lot of the larger districts. Smaller and medium districts like us ended up with a financial hit on this one as well. Reduced the instructional material allotment for the next biennium. That would be for these 2 years. That impacted districts, every district across the state. And it created statewide spend limits for some funding allotment. So what that means is, for instance, for the fast growth allotment, there's only a specific amount that the state has set aside for this. So if, once they calculate it out, it exceeds that, every district that gets those funds will be prorated down some until you get to that. So it helps the state's budget and their planning, but it hurts the districts because you may be planning on a certain amount and then at the end of the year find out that we're going to be reduced because it exceeded the statewide allotment. It adjusted some rules related to recapture for our property wealthy districts. Created some reimbursements due to the winter storm, and that's called Winter Storm Uri, as how they named that storm. So there is some funding for reimbursements. All districts were sending in reports. We have not gotten any information on any allotments for College Station ISD at this point. Created one-time technology reimbursements and broadband access. And it increased the requirements and transparency for the School Health Advisory Council, or SHAC. So those are some of the primary ones. I believe that's the end of that one for under House Bill 1525. Are there any questions?
So this entire presentation is 11 slides long, and House Bill 4545 is 5 of them. So House Bill 4545 made some huge changes for accelerated instruction. You may recall this last spring, as we were preparing for our summer programs, we spoke about the accelerated instruction requirements, and they are all new. And effective this past June. So, and applicable to the students who had just taken the test last spring as well. So this eliminates the grade retention and retesting requirements in grades 5 through 8. Those are our 2 grade levels that would have been served through grade placement committees that determined whether a student would be retained or moved forward after they failed a STAR test. It also requires schools to establish an accelerated learning committee, which replaces the grade placement committee, so we have a new name there, to develop an individualized plan and to monitor progress when a student does not pass STAR in reading or math in grades 3, 5, and 8. So they have added grade 3 to having that accelerated learning committee as well. It also adds the caveat that parents may request a particular classroom in the applicable subject area the following year, should they so choose to do so. There is not an equivalent requirement for a school district to honor that request if it is not possible to do so. So I wanted to clarify that as well. This is applicable to any student who does not pass any STAR test in grades 3 through 8 or any of our 5 end of course exams at the high school level. So this is applicable to our kiddos who are in grades 4 and up at this point as we are headed into this school year. In addition, if we were in the point in the teacher incentive allotment process where we had teachers who were already certified as master exemplary or recognized teachers, then we could either assign the students who were unsuccessful on their STAR test to one of those teachers. You may remember that we're right at the beginning of that application and implementation process with TIA. Therefore, our option is that our students need to receive supplemental instruction or tutoring before or after school or during the school day. And then they've added a lot of requirements related to that supplemental instruction. It must be targeted instruction in the TEKS. Once again, this is all linked back to STAR performance as well, and the TEKS that they did not perform well in on that STAR test. It must supplement normal instruction. So this is in addition to our regular curriculum, our regular instruction in our classrooms. And students are required to complete a minimum of 30 hours during the subsequent summer or school year per subject that they did not meet the passing standard on. If this accelerated instruction is given during the school year, it must occur at least once per week. The goal is to help students achieve satisfactory performance, and the ratio that is included in the bill is a 3-to-1 ratio of 3 students to 1 teacher. However, there are additions that they've added where we can have parents with parent partnership. We're able to complete some waivers to be able to increase that teacher to student ratio when we're providing that instruction. In addition, it must be provided by a person with training in the applicable instructional materials and under the oversight of the school district. So we are or will be able to bring in tutors they do not have to be certified teachers. We can bring in tutors, other people to help us with this and to get to that ratio, as long as we are training them in the instructional materials that we are using. And it needs to be provided by one person for the entirety of the student's supplemental instruction period, to the extent possible. So they want the students to have that same person providing the supplemental instruction. They use accelerated instruction, supplemental instruction, and high impact tutoring is synonyms. So you may hear all three of those phrases as I go through this. When we are deciding when we are going to provide this accelerated instruction, students cannot be removed from their instruction in their grade level content or their instruction in their enrichment curriculum for the grade in which they are enrolled. And they also may not be removed from recess or physical activity. So as we are processing how we are going to serve our students and meet the needs of this bill, the requirements of this bill, you'll notice that it limits when we are able to, since they must still be in their general gen ed curriculum in all 4 core subject areas. The enrichment curriculum is, of course, our elective courses, our PE classes, our fine arts, all of those other areas. And certainly we all know the value of not pulling a student from recess and physical activity during the day to be able to provide this time. Okay. Would you like to ask some questions in between, Ms. Nolan?
Yeah,
Okay.
if you don't mind. So, does this take into account a student's performance in the classroom throughout the year? Does that look at that performance at all?
This particular bill is really focused in on STAR performance and making sure that students are able to get that satisfactory score in the next school year. And so it does not take into account our students' grades or their progress on MAP growth, for example, and so forth. Our other measures are not included in meeting this requirement
Okay.
or qualifying for this requirement.
Okay, so then, and this may not be information that you have. So what is our percentage of kids that, or maybe not the percentage, but how likely is it that we have kids that are not performing well in the classroom, on a regular basis and not performing well on MAP that do fall into this category?
So anecdotally, I would say that if a student is not doing well in the classroom and on MAP, then they probably also are not doing well on STAR. So there will be some overlap. We do have another population of students who, through that consistent feedback with their teacher, growing them in their classroom, are performing well in their classroom setting, but are not showing mastery or satisfactory performance yet on the STAR test.
Okay. Thank you.
And one question for me before you leave.
Yes, ma'am. I'll go back.
Lots of requirements on the list. Any resources that come with these?
Well, interestingly enough, the state has put forth the Texas COVID Learning, I'm going to say the wrong acronym, Accelerated Supports Grant. And so Dr. Trammell is leading the way as we're looking at that grant process, T-class, to determine what aspects of it may help us. I also believe there is an underlying assumption that the ESSER 3 funds that have been allotted would help our school districts in being able to provide this. It doesn't ever say that outright, but I believe that's the underlying assumption.
So with that said, was this really kind of driven because of COVID, or do you think it would have happened anyway? This bill?
So I really, just based on the news articles and things that I've seen, I believe it really is a response to COVID and the learning recovery efforts and the state trying to make sure that schools are addressing those learning gaps that we know are there, especially in places that may not have been open in person and as much as we were. So that is a point to celebrate. Our students on the whole do very well on STAR. But we do have quite a few students who will have multiple subject areas where we have that 30-hour minimum requirement to meet. So, for example, if a student was not satisfactory on both math and their reading, then that's a 60-hour requirement for supplemental instruction. If we have a student who has 3 tests, then it's 90 hours and so forth. I also feel like before I dig into the Accelerated Learning Committee, I'm going to hop ahead. So there's a lot of information in House Bill 4545. There's a 13-page FAQ document on TEA. And as soon as it came out and we realized that this was going to apply to our students who tested in spring of 2021, since so much of the burden here is on the secondary on grades 5 and up, we started planning and brainstorming and trying to figure out how we were going to be able to comply with this. And recently, TEA has added this statement to their FAQ. And so before I jump back to the Accelerated Learning Committee, I would like to share this with you. From TEA, they've shared that it may take time for us to make the types of master scheduling, staffing changes, and whatnot needed to meet these requirements, especially since our students took these tests last spring. We got their results at the very end of May, beginning of June, just in time to move forward with our regular accelerated instruction programs. They do not have plans to strictly enforce compliance in the first year as long as districts are making reasonable efforts to meet these requirements. And so once they release this information, we pushed pause a little bit in our planning so that we could refocus our efforts in getting school open today and making sure that we were rolling out our strategic plan and all of those things that we are choosing to focus on as a district. And then next week, we are going to regroup with our principals and continue planning on how we can make this work within our constraints. So I wanted y'all to be aware of that as well. Okay. Just a quick overview here. Once again, the Accelerated Learning Committees now are required in grades 3, 5, and 8. These were formerly grade placement committees in grades 5 and 8. And this is for reading and math only. The ALC must meet before the start of the subsequent school year. I'd like to refer back to the caveat that they've given us some grace. And so we are going to continue working on holding those as we begin the school year. At a minimum, the required members are the principal, the teacher, and a parent. And the plan must provide necessary accelerated instruction and plan for the progress monitoring to enable the student to perform at the appropriate grade level at the end of the school year. This plan must be documented and a copy provided to the parent. And then students receiving special education services will have their ARD committee serve as their ALC. So it's not an additional meeting for that student or for those families. If a student fails an assessment in the same subject in the subsequent school year, the superintendent or a designee must meet with the student's Accelerated Learning Committee. And so that is a new layer that House Bill 45 brings. GPC didn't convene and follow the progress of a student. And so not only will we plan initially for this student, we'll evaluate their results on their STAR test at the end of the year. And if a student is still not satisfactory, we'll need to document why we believe that student is not satisfactory or at that performance level. Okay. All right, and so that's House Bill 4545.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Okay.
All right, and with that, we'll transition into a few of the legislative items related to personnel. So Senate Bill 1444 was passed and signed into law, and it really impacts those districts who are interested in either joining or leaving the TRS, the Teacher Retirement System, active care healthcare option. Prior to this legislation, once a district had opted into TRS active care, there was no opportunity for a district to leave the system. It was a permanent decision on the part of the ISD. This bill allows those districts that are either in or out of active care to change their decision effectively. The timeline for this, however, is December 31st for the next plan year. So in a district that is in active care, if they should so choose to seek other options, they would need to notify TRS no later than December 31st for the plan year beginning on September 1 of the following year.
Once that choice is made, it is binding for 5 years. However, if a district were to not make that decision this year, you would have another opportunity in the subsequent year. You do have to, again, provide that notice in writing and provide that notice in a timely fashion. You'll find later this evening on the regular meeting agenda an opportunity for us to charter a committee to evaluate not only this legislation, but our existing options and whether or not it is in the best interest of College Station ISD and our employees to seek options outside of TRS active care. Other employee-specific legislation includes House Bill 2519. This one goes into effect next summer. So typically in the summer, we look at our calendar, our instructional calendar in that first day of school, and we back up 45 calendar days, and that becomes what we call the penalty-free resignation date, meaning that an employee under a Chapter 21 contract can provide their resignation, and there is not really any response other than thank you for your resignation. However, after that, there potentially are some consequences associated with that if the district so chooses to not release an employee from their contract. That calendar date has now changed from 45 to 30 beginning next summer. Senate Bill 179 is related to where our school counselors spend their time. And this policy does require at least 80% of the counselor's total work time to be focused on duties that are components of a school counseling program. The law does specify that administering assessments does not count towards that 80%, but interpreting the assessment data does. We do expect that Commissioner's rules, as they come forward in the coming months, will provide a lot more clarity around what exactly is involved in that 80%. We have a fairly good idea because the TEA does have existing guidance around a school counseling program, and we don't anticipate that this will be a significant issue for us here in College Station ISD, but something to be aware of moving forward. With that, any of us would be happy to answer any questions that you all might have regarding these legislative updates. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that is the end of our agenda, so we will go ahead and adjourn, and we will be back at 6:45. We're adjourned.